r/nosleep. Hosted by you/Goodwin 1990. We found an emergency distress buoy floating in the Pacific. The message it contained made me never want to step foot in the ocean again. Part 1. I work on a deep-sea fishing boat off the west coast of the US. For years, I've seen nothing odd or terrifying beyond an occasional storm or injuries given to crewmates by rigging or our catch. I've always loved the sea, and always felt safe and at peace on it. However, a few weeks ago, as we were pulling up our catch, something got tangled in our starboard net. When we managed to pull it aboard, it turned out to be an emergency distress buoy, one which had clearly spent a very long time in the water. We examined it, and found a slightly faded stamp in the metal and polyurethane declaring for it to be turned into the Navy if found. While the captain went to the wheelhouse to radio it in, I examined further, finding the radio emitter broken. That explained why it had never been picked up. I also discovered a sealed compartment on the side, inside which lay a waterproof baggie. It contained many pieces of paper, on which somebody with a very shaky hand had written. What unnerved me was the fact that they seemed to have dried bloodstains on them. Against better judgment, I opened the bag and read them as we sailed back to port. When I finished, I immediately brought them to the captain, who turned pale as he read them. He jammed them back into the baggie and instructed me to place it back. The tone of his voice indicated that it was a demand, not a request. He also said that the Navy would be meeting us at the dock to collect the buoy. I did as he asked. However, before I did, I used the ship's scanner to make copies. When we got back to port, we indeed were met by a large group of men who immediately swarmed our small vessel. They took the buoy and made us all sign a bunch of papers, saying that we would say nothing about what we found. All they would say was it was classified. They also said they'd financially reward us. When they left, the captain simply told us to forget about it. Since then, I've kept the copies hidden in my desk. Until now, I debated what to do, and even thought about destroying them. But, I figured that this needs to be shared, and here is the best place I know. I know I'll likely get in very serious trouble for this, but I'll deal with it when I cross that particular bridge. There was a single date at the top of the first page, indicating it was written in 2016. I'm transcribing the pages exactly as written, which may take a bit, seeing as how some pages are difficult to read. I'm honestly not sure what to think of it. But, if there's any grain of truth to what is written, I'm not sure if I will ever step foot in the ocean again. Here's what it said. To whoever finds this message, I beg of you, do not let anyone attempt to mount a rescue operation for us. By the time you find this, I, or anyone on my team for that matter, will be long past the ability of anyone to save. I'm only writing this so somebody in the right position on the surface may have an account of the horrors that have befallen us down here. In the dark and cold void which has become my colleagues' eternal tombs. And very soon will become mine as well. And as a warning, to try and ward off any other scientists, military, or anyone for that matter, from attempting to recover what we had been sent down here to uncover and study. It may end up being in vain, God knows. I know all too well now that us humans often fail to ignore the warnings that are subtly given to us to stay away, even when they are directly under our noses, but, I must make an attempt anyways with the little time I have remaining. Before they find where I've hidden myself. For the record, my name is Desmond Windows. I'm 35 years old, and I was, a professor at the University of Oregon's Institute for Marine Biology. I had been teaching there for the last 8 years after graduating at the top of my class. I always had a quick thinking and tenacious mind, able to outthink and outperform even some of my own teachers. Due to my accelerated performance, I ended up graduating 3 years earlier than intended, and was personally contacted by the dean himself, asking if I'd be willing to take up part-time tenure to help the small and very much overburdened staff down in Charleston. I immediately accepted the offer. I always loved being able to teach others about my passion for the ocean and all of its creatures, but I told him that I would also be out at times of the year, since I had also already agreed to sign on with a large oceanic research corporation, which for personal reasons shall remain unnamed, due to my years of diving experience, especially since I had been certified as an advanced open water diver, and I had also completed training and been certified to be capable of safely operating an atmospheric diving suit, or ADS for short. About 6 weeks ago, I was contacted by a fellow scientist and old friend of mine. David Gimbel and I had met at an oceanic conservation panel about 6 years ago, though his career had taken a vastly different direction than mine had. He'd been contracted by a private group that I'd never heard of before to act as a consultant and the head diver of their underwater salvage and research division. He basically supervised the lower down members of his team on locating long-forgotten shipwrecks, maintaining oil rig platforms, excavating underwater ruins, stuff of that nature, and he was allowed in return to use their diving suits and submersibles to conduct studies on deep-water species of fish and cetaceans in his off time. He told me that the group had heard about my merits and expertise, not only on working in deep water, but also about my secondary degrees in ancient languages, archaeology, and oceanography, and were interested in signing me on to an expedition currently underway. Apparently, while trying to map the ocean floor for wrecks, their sonar systems had detected an unusual anomaly about 4,000 feet below the surface. They had passed over the anomaly a few times more, using an advanced system called side-scan sonar. Basically, for those who do not know much about mapping the sea floor, it works almost exactly like the sonar systems you have in all boats, except you use a towfish, or a torpedo-shaped device trolled behind the boat, which emits conical pulses towards the seafloor across a wide area perpendicular to the path of the sensor, and in basic terms, creates an image or map of the seafloor it passes over. When the team had reviewed the map created, they were shocked to see what appeared to be ruins on the bottom, across a 3-mile wide area. They had also discovered an American World War II battleship located less than a half a mile from the ruins, dug sideways into the seafloor. To them, they had more or less hit the jackpot. A previously undiscovered shipwreck, which would net them a hefty financial discovery fee from the Navy, and what appeared to be sunken ruins from some ancient civilization which had once been above the waves. It's stuff people in their profession usually only dreamed about. Immediately, plans had been put in play to set down a deep ocean research station for scientists, biologists, and other assorted team members to be able to study both sites. I stopped him at that point and asked him why they would need either me or him. While both of us knew how to pilot submersibles and ROVs, our forte was in ad suits, and the deepest one could currently go so far in one was about 2,000 feet down, only halfway to the distance the sites were in. He leaned in, and in a hushed tone, explained to me that the group had, in almost absolute secrecy, with the exception of the appropriate agencies needed to certify and approve it for safety, developed an advanced version of the new exosuits that could withstand the pressures at over 5,000 feet underwater. They say they could theoretically keep you safe to 7,500 feet, he told me, but it's untested. He then proceeded to tell me that his group wanted me to lead the diving team to explore, film, catalog, and potentially bring to the surface some of the ruins for surface teams to study, while he would lead the team to work over the shipwreck. They would pay me handsomely for my time, in addition to being named as one of the head discoverers of whatever lay down there. I would become immortal in the history books for my findings as well. The amount of zeros Gimbal told me would be on my paycheck, plus the opportunity to be remembered forever went to my head immediately, and before he could even say anything else, I told him I would take their offer. Such a goddamn stupid decision. I was almost immediately afterward flown from the US to New Zealand, where I boarded the group's ship, the Oceanic Explorer, in Auckland, and spent almost a week heading to our destination, which lay about 200 miles from the Pitcairn Islands. When we arrived, we were greeted by 5 other ships clustered around one area of sea, 2 belonging to the same company, and 3 the Navy. They had rigged a platform that dangled between them where the submersibles could arrive, dock, and then disembark again into the depths. Once tied up with the other vessels, Gimbal and I were taken to a private briefing led by a man who clearly couldn't even fit into a diving suit if his life depended on it. No, he was clearly a topside leader. He sat us both down and, after having us sign over half a dozen non-disclosure agreements, to make sure that we wouldn't blab to any reporters before they could announce their findings themselves, you could tell they had been fucked over before more than once by that problem, he showed us the map created by the sonar. Both of us stared in almost utter shock at what we saw. They were definitely ruins, all right. They lay in many patterns, the innermost almost circular in pattern, with outcroppings leading off in a straight direction. That was the biggest giveaway. Nature does not do straight lines. He also pointed out the battleship wreck lying just off to the side, which David focused on, but I was too enthralled by what I saw to care. I studied every inch of the sonar image of those ruins, mentally mapping them into my mind, deducing where the best place to start my sweep would be. My mind was racing with endless possibilities as well. How old would they have to be, to remain undiscovered for so long? Certainly I could understand why nobody had ever found them. We've only explored about 5% of the ocean so far, and anything could be hidden in that remaining 95%. After we'd been finished with our regular briefing, the man, named Casey, warned us that a tropical storm was brewing about 80 miles to the west of us, and was heading in our direction. He told us that if it didn't alter its course, the topside ships would have to pull out to a safer location until it passed, which he said out here, could take a couple of weeks. We'd also be out of radio contact with them as well, which meant that if any emergency arose beneath the waves, all we'd have would be the onboard doctor, her staff, and her equipment. We both told him that we understood, and we'd make sure to keep ourselves and our team as safe as we possibly could. After, We were both ushered from the ship onto the platform, where alone, 3-man submersible waited to take us down. Carrying only one duffel bag of clothing and personal belongings each, we squeezed into the tight interior, and the hatch was sealed. 2 safety divers swam around us, making final checks to be sure the submersible was ready for descent. One approached the small window in the front and flashed the OK sign to our pilot. I craned my neck to catch a final glimpse of the orange sunset disappearing on the horizon, and then we slipped quietly below the waves and began our descent into the deep. There's a reason why the area of water where we were heading is dubbed the Midnight Zone. When you're down there, you are so far from the surface that no light can reach you. Aside from the artificial lights of the sub, or the occasional flashes made by deep-sea creatures, there is nothing around you but blackness. An impenetrable darkness that almost seems to reach out with vast, unseen clawed hands to wrap around you, like it wishes to suffocate you in its unending embrace. Even when you've dove in water this deep 100 times, you still get an eerie, almost primal sense of fear looking out past where the light cannot reach, because you can't see what lurks just beyond the veil. I feel ashamed, like a little child afraid of monsters under the bed or in the closet, by saying that I felt a huge sense of relief when I spotted the station appearing beneath us, the darkness shooed away by dozens of lights mounted on and around it. I could see other divers in what had to be the new exosuits plodding around the outside of the base, setting up their final camera systems and setting down huge cases of equipment for the coming days and weeks of exploration and surveying. Our sub moved into position and hooked onto a hatch that would allow us to transfer from it into the base itself. After the water had been drained and the pressure equalized, the pilot unscrewed the hatch and opened it for us to climb through. He gave us a cheerful smile and a pat on the back as we climbed through. "Have a good stay, lads," he called after us with an Irish accent. "I'll be seeing you in about 6 to 7 weeks. Be safe." We both thanked him, and he sealed the hatch again, disconnecting himself from the station, and slowly began his long ascent back up to the surface, leaving the two of us to marvel at what we had stepped into. It was clear that tens of millions, if not billions of dollars had been invested into designing the base. It had been placed directly between the two sites, and it was huge. Of course, it had to be to accommodate the number of people on our 2 teams, plus the 3 members of the medical staff. The entire structure had been made from a metal that could withstand the immense pressure pressing down on it from all sides. You could always hear the structure creak and groan as it won its endless battles with the water outside. Right away we were met by the base's leader, a tall, lanky man with hair that stuck out like the spines of a sea urchin named Carruthers. He showed us to our cabins to drop off our gear, then escorted us to the main observation area and operations room, located in the center of the base. There was a rather large dome window dominating the far wall, made out of extremely strong and durable plexiglass that allowed anyone in the room to look out at the work any divers in the immediate vicinity were doing, along with a bank of consoles on the opposite wall that showed the views of half a dozen cameras mounted outside, and also ones that were mounted on the shoulders of the exosuits. I took a glance out the window at the darkness, just out of range of the lights, and unwillingly shuddered, before shaking my head and turning back to Carruthers and Gimbal. "You're absolutely obsessed with the ocean, and have been almost as deep as this before," I chided myself. "You know better than most people what really lays in the gloom, so stop looking out there and letting your subconscious think up things that aren't there." Shaking the feeling from my mind, I focused in and listened to the man speak. He filled us in on what had been done so far. They had set up the perimeter around the base, and had also set up rope guides with light poles leading to both sites, but hadn't actually begun any surveying yet. They had been instructed to wait on our arrival to begin that stage of work. We were to rest up and meet our respective teams when they returned from outside. Tomorrow, we would both set out on our respective paths to begin our initial sweeps. We would each be in charge of 6 people, plus ourselves. He told us that everyone had been hand-picked by the group's board members for their qualifications and merits, and that they could all handle themselves under intense pressures and time constraints. All they needed were natural leaders, and that was us. He first walked David through the info they had acquired on the battleship, and this time, I chose to listen out of sheer curiosity. He said that the ship had gone missing halfway through the war without a single trace. Their last report had been that they were about to be battered by a huge storm, but their last known location was what baffled me. According to a few declassified military records they had been given by the Navy, when the last known position had been transmitted, it was all the way up near the Philippines. Thousands of miles away from here. My mind raced with confusion, trying to use reason and logic to come to a sensible conclusion. How in the hell could they have been blown this far off course? I could understand that they may have been blown a few hundred miles from where they should, but this far? Surely they would have noticed, if not with their equipment, then at least by maps, the stars and constellations. At least the fact there was no land for hundreds of miles. I couldn't make sense of it. The look on David's face told me he had the same thoughts. Carruthers explained that the US Navy had been notified immediately about the wreck, and they had asked personally for it to be photographed and documented for their records, along with ours. It was the primary reason for their financial aid. They wanted to know what had caused the wreck as much as we did. After he finished, he turned to me and only said very brief words about my expedition. There wasn't really much he could say anyways. They had little to no information about the ruins, other than what I had been told on the surface and the sonar map. He did say that he wanted my team and I to move very slowly, as nobody could tell how old they really were. After we finished documenting and cataloging everything where it lay, then we could begin to see if we could lift any pieces and bring them back to the base to study. I told him I understood and was ready when he deemed it was time to go. Inside though, I was bursting with the excitement and giddiness of a child discovering a Native American arrowhead in a stream. I couldn't wait to get out there and set foot in a place that nobody could have set in thousands of years. Even still, and though I mentally kicked myself for the ridiculous emotions I felt, I still refused to turn and look out in the abyss until I left the room and closed the hatch behind me. That evening, we met everyone at dinner in the galley. My team was comprised of 4 men and 2 women: King, Alton, Figueroa, Brockman, Notting, and Carpenter. All of them were very experienced deep-sea divers. King, Brockman and Notting were commercial salvage divers. All 3 had worked together for over 10 years, and you could easily tell that there was a distinct camaraderie between the 3 of them. Alton, Figueroa and Carpenter were more along the lines of my work, Figueroa being a fellow marine biologist and oceanographer herself, and Alton and Carpenter had both graduated from Florida State with degrees in archaeology and oceanography, and were also accredited surveyors. We soon all struck up a friendly vibe from various discussions about our shared love of the water, of 80s horror movies and various other subjects, and within an hour were laughing and joking like we had known each other for years. I could see David had also won over his team, though I had never gotten the time to properly learn any of their names. Now that I think about it, I never really learned any of their names, except for the few he ever said to me. We finished up eating, and then each retired to our respective quarters to rest up for the huge undertaking we'd all be facing tomorrow. And while we may have all gone to sleep wishing the other pleasant dreams, with the exception of Figueroa, being an apparent prankster, she snuck a rubber eel into Notting's bed, causing him to scream with an almost girly, high-pitched scream which caused the rest of us to burst into uncontrollable laughter. I couldn't fall asleep peacefully. My mind seemed unable to shut down, and I tossed and turned, all the while feeling like there were fingers running themselves around inside my head. I glanced at one of the only personal possessions I had brought with me on the metal table beside the bed. A framed photograph of a smiling face, long raven black hair, olive-colored skin, and emerald green eyes, a white smile beaming out from an amazingly happy moment. Jackie. I turned away, unwilling to let my mind dive down that road, and again felt that weird feeling, like my skull was being massaged and probed around from within. For a moment, I swore I could almost hear her voice calling my name. Desmond. I shook it away, forcing myself to ignore it and fall asleep. Knowing what I do now, though, if I'd realized what it had meant, I almost feel like I would have willingly walked to one of the diving airlocks and let the water rush in, drowning all of us. It would have been a death less horrific and painful than they ended up with. We awoke early the next day, all buzzing with anticipation at what we were about to do. My team and I were directed into the east airlock, and David and his were sent to the west. We all helped one another into our suits, and one of the medical team checked to make sure that they were all pressurized and sealed. They sealed the inner airlock door, and then flooded the room, pumping in seawater from outside. Once the room was completely filled, the outer hatch opened, and one by one, we slowly stepped out into the void. They have definitely done an amazing job on the exosuits, I can't deny that. They withstood the pressure outside perfectly, and were only as slow and cumbersome as the older models were. Like the previous model, they were equipped with shoulder-mounted lights, built-in heating units to keep the freezing cold of the outside water at bay, and a remote camera mounted on the side of the helmet for Carruthers and the rest of the people inside to watch. Also brought over were 2 thrusters mounted on top of our oxygen canisters that were controlled by joysticks and switches inside the suit. Walking around on the bottom of the ocean is almost exactly like walking on the surface of the moon. It's extremely slow going, so the thrusters aid you in moving around at a faster pace. We made sure our comms were working, both between each of us and the base itself, and after quickly instructing my team to stay safe, take their time working, keep in constant communication, and most importantly, to always work in teams of 2 and never wander off alone, we moved over to the equipment waiting for us near the beginning of the guide rope, picked it up, and then began our journey towards the ruins. The trip took us about 15 minutes to make. I was thankful for the guide rope and the lights that were spaced about 30 feet or so along the line. After all, down here, all it takes is a split second, one wrong step into the darkness, and you can easily become lost and disoriented. There are stories stretching as far back as the beginning of deep-sea diving of divers who became lost in the blackness, never to be seen again. I kept my gaze focused straight ahead of me, waiting to see my first glimpse at the reason I'd been brought down here. And a few minutes later, I was rewarded for my vigilance. Holy Jesus, Mother of God, I heard Figueroa almost breathe. The sonar map hadn't been able to properly show the enormity of the site. The first stone pillars we saw, covered with ages of muck, algae and growth, rose high above our heads, almost to the point that the top of them were out of sight in the gloom provided by the final guide light. I knew there were more beyond it, just out of sight, but the thought that all of this covered an almost 3-mile wide stretch of ocean floor was almost incomprehensible to my brain. I was absolutely awestruck, my entire team was as well, but I shook my head to clear it. We had a job to do today, and only about 9 or 10 hours of oxygen to get it done. I turned back to my team, and gave them their tasks of the day to perform. We all would work as one unit at first, setting up lights in and around the inner portion of the site to be able to properly see what we were doing. Once that was finished, Alton and Carpenter would begin their surveying duties, using a remotely operated variation of the side scan sonar system to give us a 3-dimensional map of the entire site, which would then be transmitted back to the base for us to look over at the end of the day. While they were doing that, the remaining 5 of us would divide into teams of 2 to do an initial sweep of the area, shooting video and taking still photographs for documentation. We would do other tasks, including trying to date the ruins another day. With my instructions finished, along with a reminder to stay safe and alert, we began work. With the 7 of us working in tandem, we were able to set up the lights in less than 2.5 hours, and when we were finished, the darkness had been banished away, the ocean forced to reveal what it had kept hidden for so long. It was absolutely incredible. Somehow, even after all this time, despite the ocean currents and the crushing embrace, almost all of the pillars had remained intact, save for a select few that had crumbled into large piles of stones. Alton and Carpenter had already begun their survey. You could easily hear the whirring of the sensor as it wound its way through the ancient structures. Occasionally, you could see the bright yellow machine move slowly over your head as they joked with each other and made bets about who would win an upcoming baseball game they would miss. Meanwhile, we had each teamed up and moved slowly down the rows of pillars towards the circular center. I had chosen to have Figueroa partner with me. Not only had she and I developed the best rapport of everyone, but in my professional opinion, she seemed the most centered, calm and astute of the rest of us. We each took a side and filmed and photographed pillars every couple of feet, getting closer to where it all converged, maintaining constant radio contact with each other and the other groups. About halfway down, she called me over to her side. "Take a look at this, Windows," she said, and proceeded to use the claw hand of her suit to rub away the muck as gently as possible. For a second, I couldn't distinguish a damn thing, but then I realized what she had spotted. There were images carved deeply into the stone. Some were pictures, and others were what I could only assume were hieroglyphs or an ancient language I couldn't read. I didn't need to though, the carved pictures were sufficient enough to explain themselves. Depicted on the small portion of exposed stone that I could see was what I can only describe as something truly monstrous. The creature was gargantuan in size, with the head of a wolf eel, one gigantic black eye staring directly at the viewer, and an almost humanoid body, covered in what appeared to be black scales. It reached towards the surface with webbed, clawed hands for what looked like a tribal boat, its occupants cowering in fear at their sealed fate. Around its torso swam smaller creatures, what had to be underlings of the monstrosity. They, too, appeared to be humanoid in shape, but with the heads of viperfish atop their shoulders, their huge, razor-sharp maws poised open to catch the unfortunate victims that managed to avoid death from their leader. I scraped away algae from the carving underneath and shuddered softly at the next image. The huge creature had dragged the entire ship down to the bottom of the ocean and was, slowly torturing its drowning victims. Limbs had been torn off, and a clear expression of malicious glee adorned its inhuman features. Still others were being torn to shreds by the smaller monsters. The carving was so detailed that I could see each individual expression of horror and pain eternally frozen on each person's face. "My God!" I heard Figueroa say next to me. I shook my head. "I'm as much of a scientific man as you can be, Liza, but that..." I closed my eyes, the images burned into the back of my eyelids. "That is the furthest thing from God you could possibly get." I opened my eyes again, raised my camera and snapped off a few shots of the carvings, then turned away, an almost desperate need to get away from whatever ancient civilization had conjured up that beast overwhelming me. "Come on, let's get to the center and finish up today's work." The circular center was absolutely massive. We estimated it to be almost 1.5 miles across from the end of one row of pillars, to the beginning of another on the far side. Here and there, We could see some smaller formations rising up to about chest height at varying distances, but for the most part, it was flat, save for an odd spiral that had been carved into the smooth stone deep enough that the outline could still be seen. When you dropped down onto it, you could feel the dips, even through the ages of mud and muck that had accumulated over it. We all moved out to a distance of about 5 feet from one another and, as a team, slowly moved across to the other side. We were about halfway across when I heard Nodding let out a shout of surprise, followed by curses. "Everyone stop," I called. "Nodding, you alright?" "Yeah, I'm fine," was the muttered reply I received. I needed more information, though. When you're working in deep water, one small mistake can cost a diver his life. "What happened?" I pressed. After a few seconds of silence, he answered. Goddamn gulper eel suddenly appeared out of nowhere, coming straight for my face. Caught me off guard, and I stumbled back into a rock formation. "Nothing's damaged on my suit, I just finished checking." I let out a sigh of relief as the rest of the group burst into laughter. "What, were you afraid that you were gonna be swallowed whole?" Brockman said in a sing-song voice, trying to lighten the mood. Everybody laughed harder, myself and even Nodding joining in. It helped loosen the sudden burst of tension that had fallen over us for that split second. After all, even from 15 feet away, I could see the sheepish expression he wore through his faceplate. "I just got startled to hell and back," that was all he said in return. He sighed. "I hate to say this, Windows, and I'm sorry, but when I backed into that formation, I knocked it over. I thrust it around the others to inspect the damage." He was right, the small pillar had indeed been knocked over. It lay on its side, a small shroud of muck settling around it. It still looked to be in one piece, however. "It's okay, Nodding, it didn't break at all, just fell on its side. You're safe from being chewed out by me or Carruthers." He let out a relieved sigh, and then looked down at the gauges lining the inside of his suit. "Thank Christ. Well, we got 2 hours of oxygen remaining, boss. You want to finish up surveying this area and head back to base?" I didn't answer him right away, however. I was staring down at where the pillar had clearly been knocked out from. There was a slot there, a rectangular opening about 3 or 4 feet across. But it didn't seem to only go down a few inches or even a few feet. The blackness in that space seemed greater, almost as if there was a space much larger and deeper beneath it. I felt the same, odd sensation in my head again, this time a little stronger. And, for a split second, I was overcome with a desire to peer into the slot, to even swim into it. It was almost as if something had hooked itself into my brain and was trying to reel me in. I was snapped out of my moment by Brockman calling my name. "Windows?" she asked tentatively. I looked up at everyone. They all wore puzzled, confused expressions on their faces as they stared at me. Shaking away the last tendrils of my insane thought, I pulled myself together. "Yeah, you're right, Nodding. Let's finish up this area and be done for the day." The next 3 weeks proceeded without incident for my own team, as well as David's. We both made very good progress on our respective sites, cataloging and documenting extensively. The feeling that I'd had during that first dive hadn't returned since, and I felt more like myself, more eager to learn all we could about the ruins. The surface team had contacted us 2 days ago, and had informed us that the storm was almost on top of us, so they would have to pull back until the storm either passed by, or blew itself out. They did, however, authorize us to bring back a few pieces of the site to further study, and we had very selectively chosen 3 smaller ones, using commercial lift bags to float them back to the base. Once inside, they had been brought to the lab for us to clean up and study. There had been more carvings depicting the same monster as I'd seen on the carving I'd examined the first time, along with what we now were sure had to be a very ancient language. Using specialized scanning equipment, we had put it into a computer and had set it to attempt to translate to English. So far, it had been running for almost 3 days with no success. We headed back out in the meantime to document the outer edges of the site, one of what we assumed to be our final initial passes. We had again divided up into teams of 2, and had fanned out over a distance of about 100 feet from the next team. This time around, I'd paired up with Carpenter, who'd volunteered to help me photograph and film the end of one particular row of pillars. We were about halfway done with our job, when I noticed a glint of something red and metallic reflecting off the glow of the nearest light. I turned and felt my jaw drop open. What, in the absolute fuck? I was staring at a tricycle. A goddamn red children's tricycle, sitting perfectly upright on the bottom, not even 20 feet from me. Confusion filled my mind. How in the hell did that get down here? I narrowed my eyes and tried to think of a logical explanation. It could have fallen off someone's boat as it passed over the area, but there were 2 things that just seemed wrong to me. If it had fallen off someone's boat, it had to have been very freaking soon. It still had all of its paint on it, and there was absolutely no sign of rust. Not to mention that there was not even a tiny bit of algae covering it. But, more unsettling than that, was the creeping sensation I felt. That tricycle, I couldn't put my finger on it, but it looked familiar. Almost as if I'd seen it before somewhere. Trying to shake off the odd feeling, I turned and called to Carpenter's back. "Hey, Sean, would you fucking look at this? I just found an honest-to-God tricycle down here on the." I trailed off as I turned back. It was gone. It had vanished into thin air. Or in this case, thin water. I blinked a couple of times, trying to rationalize with my own mind. What the? I shook my head hard, then looked down at my gauges, suddenly concerned with my own safety. Am I developing NN? Nitrogen narcosis is irreversible, but at these depths a very dangerous alteration in consciousness caused by the anesthetic effect of certain gases at high pressures, which comes with a variety of symptoms. One of which includes auditory and visual hallucinations. To combat this, we were using a mixture of helium and oxygen in our air supply, but at these previously unventured depths with diving suits, I wondered if the mixture wasn't potent enough to ward off the onset. "You say something, boss?" I heard Carpenter call behind me. Still trying to come to a conclusion in my own mind, I decided not to tell him what I'd seen. "Not yet, anyways." "Nothing, man," I called back. For another minute or so, I gazed out into the darkness, trying to piece together jigsaw puzzles in my mind, to figure if we should head back or not, just in case my assumptions were correct. I decided it'd be better to be safe than sorry. "Hey, Sean, let's round up the others and head back to base." "Something's not right here," he didn't answer me. I turned, my worry giving way to a small twinge of annoyance. "Did you hear me, man?" Carpenter was gone. There was absolutely no trace that he'd ever been there, except for his bag of gear, which lay untouched where he'd put it down. What the shit? I looked down the row of columns to see if I could see the orange-yellowish outline of his suit or the beam of his shoulder lights. Nothing. Where the hell did he go? He couldn't have slipped away that quietly, the thrusters make too much sound to do so, and unless he'd somehow mastered running away underwater in an 800-pound diving suit, he couldn't have disappeared on foot. Confusion gave way to the first tendrils of worry. I looked up at the nearest team to me, which were Figueroa and Brockman. "Hey, guys?" I called out in a voice that shook a little. "Did either of you see Carpenter pass by you?" They both looked over in confusion at me. "No, isn't he with you?" I didn't answer. Worry had begun to be crept up on by the first real tendrils of fear. I tried to keep my mind in check. I had to control myself. All of my team were counting on me to get them back safely, but in my mind, I couldn't help it. My memory shot back to a painting I'd purchased for my house about 3 years ago. A painting of a deep-sea diver in an old-school suit, light emanating from his helmet, as dozens of huge tentacles appeared behind him out of the gloom, ready to snatch him in an eternal embrace and drag him backwards to a watery grave. I spun around to face the darkness that I had turned my back to, almost half expecting to see that very sight before me. But there was nothing there. Just blackness. By this time, I could hear the rest of my team churning up a frenzy over the comms. They had all heard me, and were now calling out, trying to get Carpenter to reply to them, but to no avail. Carruthers was also trying to cut through the barrage of voices, trying to understand what was going on. Sheer panic and chaos had suddenly come crashing down on all of us. Pulling myself together, I summoned all of the emotional strength I could muster. "Shut up," I yelled as loud as I could into my mic. The jumble of voices ceased immediately. Quickly, I relayed to Carruthers what had happened, and asked him what the best course of action would be to take, with the knowledge that we only had about an hour and a quarter of air remaining. He was quiet for a moment, and then gave the order for us to search for our missing teammate for 15 minutes, no longer. Then get our asses back to the base, on the double. Copy that, I told him, and then told the rest of my team to gather up at my position. As one, we made our way through the ruins for the next 15 minutes, calling out over the comms, trying to get a response from Carpenter. But we found no trace of him at all. It was as if he'd been wiped from existence. With a vice gripping around my heart, and an unshakable feeling of dread coursing through me, I gave the order at 15 minutes for the rest of us to head back, and stay close to each other. As we began our way back along the guide line, I swear that it felt like the darkness held at bay around us by the light seemed to creep just a little bit closer, as if testing to see if it could reach us.